Hello again, it's Alister McGrath, helping you to find your way through my textbook, Christian Theology Introduction. So we come to the last of the 4 opening chapters dealing with some theological landmarks. And in this 4th chapter, we look at the emergence of the modern period, which is here taken to refer to the period between 1750 and today. And during this period, Christianity underwent significant transformation. It expanded outside its traditional European heartlands and experienced difficulties and tensions within them. And although Christian theology remained deeply influenced by European and North American writers throughout this period, it gradually became a global phenomenon. And this has had a very significant impact on contemporary theology, and it's important to understand the issues that began to emerge and the questions that began to be debated. So let's begin by highlighting the importance of the movement known as the Enlightenment, which is generally thought to have begun in Western Europe during the 18th century. And this movement placed a lot of emphasis on human reason, arguing that reason allowed potentially divisive debates about revelation to be avoided. Nowadays, we tend to see the Enlightenment as a family of movements rather than a single movement with diverging agendas and emphasis, which is held together by a basic conviction that reason is able to illuminate and resolve many of the great social and political questions of the age. Now, some older works speak about an age of reason emerging during the 18th century, which is to be contrasted with an earlier age of faith. But I have to say that use of the phrase the age of reason is a bit misleading because it implies that reason had hitherto been marginalized or ignored, which is clearly not true. I mean, look at chapter 2, where we thought about the Middle Ages and its emphasis on demonstrating the rationality of faith. But while the Middle Ages saw reason as a critical tool, the Enlightenment treated it as the foundation of reliable knowledge. Now, as I've said, the Enlightenment was a complex movement, taking different forms in various parts of Europe and America. But one of its most characteristic features is its emphasis on the ability of human reason to penetrate at least some of the mysteries of the world. Humanity is able to think for itself without the need for any assistance from God. Unaided human reason is able to make sense of the world, including those aspects of the world traditionally claimed as their own by theologians. Now we can see this rational approach to life's great questions in Christian Wolff's famous work, Rational Thoughts About God, the World and the Human Soul. And many commentators have focused on its frontispiece, which portrays the light of reason, dispelling the clouds of ignorance and superstition. And this is a powerful image of the optimism of this age, which saw unaided human reason as the means by which all of life's great questions might be solved. This emphasis on the capacity of unaided human reason called into question some core themes of Christian theology. For example, the doctrine of the Trinity was rejected as irrational. The idea of revelation was rejected as unnecessary. Reason can tell us everything we know. And traditional Christian understandings of the identity of Jesus Christ were criticized for their apparent irrationality. For rationalist writers, Jesus was simply a religious teacher and nothing more. This language of the incarnation meant nothing. So it was around this time that the famous quest for the historical Jesus began to develop, looking for a simpler and more rational understanding of Jesus than those traditionally associated with Christian theology. All of these developments, or with many others, including the rise of Marxism and Darwinism in the 19th century, would shape Christian theology during the 20th century and remain important today. Yet in more recent years, the reliability of the Enlightenment's view of things has been challenged. The rise of postmodernity has reflected a growing dissatisfaction with the Enlightenment's appeal to reason as the ultimate judge of beliefs. Postmodernity has seen a major reaction against this excessive reliance on reason and a growing realization of how reason can be abused. This has important theological consequences, which we look at in this chapter. So let's look at its structure in more detail. The first section is about theology and cultural developments in the West. And it opens by looking at the growing anxiety about the capacity of religion to generate conflict in Western Europe, particularly resulting from the European wars of religion. And people began to feel something had to be done about this. And the rise of the Enlightenment is linked with this anxiety about religion. By appealing to reason, it seemed possible to avoid the endless debates about the interpretation of the Bible, which seemed to lie at the heart of so many religious disagreements and conflicts. Reason was argued to be a universal human faculty and thus capable of settling national and international disputes without reference to religion. Yeah, I need to say that although the Enlightenment was seen by an earlier generation of scholars as hostile to religion, the scholarly understanding of the relation of the Enlightenment and Christianity has gone through a major change since the 1970s. And in more recent years, the older narrative of the essentially secular nature of the Enlightenment is in the process of being replaced by something more complex and nuanced. Now, the chapter includes some case studies to help you appreciate the general features of the Enlightenment critique of Christian theology. And one of these was the criticism of the idea of supernatural revelation. The new appeal to human reason made revelation unnecessary. Furthermore, it lacked the universality of human reason. Everyone, the Enlightenment argued, had access to reason, whereas only a select few had access to revelation. The doctrine of the Trinity was subject of particular criticism by Enlightenment writers. They held it to be mathematical nonsense. And under the pressure of rationalist criticism, many Orthodox Christian writers de-emphasized this doctrine. And it's interesting to note that the revival of confidence in the doctrine of the Trinity dates from the 20th century as the influence of the Enlightenment began to wane. We then begin to look at two influential movements of the 19th century, which have a significant, I have to say, ongoing impact on Christian theology. We're talking about Marxism and Darwinism. And I explore each of these, trying to tease out its relevance for the development of Christian theology and also how it plays into some debates of today. Now, the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 led to some very significant developments in Christian theology, especially within European Protestantism. And the immediate post-war years were widely seen as witnessing the final collapse of the cultural heritage of the 19th century. People want to move away from this, feeling it has gone wrong. And Karl Barth is a very good example of a theologian who argues in this way. We've been let down by the theological past. The dominant approach to theology found in liberal Protestantism was simply inadequate. It took its leads from cultural trends, and look at where that took us, the First World War. Barth saw the Great Wars having destroyed the credibility of any approach to theology rooted in a cultural context. Obviously, there have been significant developments since then. For example, the rise of postmodernism really calls into question the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason. And it's very helpful to see postmodernity as a critique of the Enlightenment's notion of rationality, leading to the proposal of alternative ways of thinking about the nature of human reason. And postmodern philosophers have raised some significant concerns about what they call the Enlightenment project. And there's a growing trend to reject the idea of truth based on some notion of universal rationality, because reason is now seen as more complex, more context-based. So that has important implications for a number of areas of Christian theology. I mentioned earlier the importance of globalization, and the spectacular growth of Christianity during the 20th century in sub-Saharan Africa, China, and Korea illustrates this trend. And this naturally opens up important questions of contextualization. For example, how is the doctrine of the Trinity to be understood in an Indian context? Now, this fourth chapter follows the patterns of the first three by identifying key theologians of the era. And there are too many of them to mention here. They include John Henry Newman, Karl Barth, Paul Tillich, Karl Rahner, and Wolfhard Pannenberg. And there are many other modern theologians that are noted and engaged elsewhere in the volume, like Sarah Coakley, Mary Daly, and Elizabeth Johnson. And we also looked at a number of major modern theological movements, such as liberal Protestantism, modernism, neo-orthodoxy, liberation theologies, feminism, and post-liberalism. In each case, you were introduced to the movement's basic approach and helped to understand its impact and significance. And after reading this chapter, you'll be in a good place to be able to, in effect, enter into some significant theological debates. I think that's very important. Old theologies never die. They just get recycled and reappropriated, often, I have to say, in very creative and productive ways. So I hope you'll enjoy reading about these developments and that this chapter will help you to make sense of some of today's debates. So that brings us to the end of the first part of this work. The first 4 chapters noted some theological landmarks. So have a break, and then we're going to move on to the second part of the work, which consists of 4 chapters dealing with questions of sources and methods in Christian theology. I look forward to speaking to you again soon, and thank you so much for listening.